Opera GX is on a mission to get people to break up with boring browsers and have fun while doing it. The message is simple: Opera GX is not for everyone. But if your game, it's time to stop browsing like a lame and get with a real one. Simply put, default browsers are just really boring. I mean, they don't have GX mods for starters, which give you a lot of customization. My favorite mod is Lo-Fi Chill, which allows you to play some lo-fi chill background music, have some cool unique keyboard sounds, as well as opening and closing tab sounds, as well as mess with the theme and the colors of the browser itself. The mod itself also has a dedicated wallpaper, and disabling and enabling mods and the individual modifications in the mods menu is quite easy from the sidebar. Visit the GX store to find out more mods and which ones you might like. The other reason to choose Opera GX is that it, well, doesn't hog your PC resources. Default browsers do. To enhance performance on your PC when gaming when your browser is open and to get rid of lag while playing games and listening to music, it's perfect to have the GX control feature, which allows you to limit the amount of CPU or RAM you're willing to let your browser use. As an example, on screen I can pull up a comparison between Opera GX and Chrome opened in Task Manager simultaneously, and you can look at the comparisons in RAM and CPU. I think all of those are plenty good reasons to go check out Opera GX. And at the very least, if you download Opera GX by using the link in the description, you can save that cat that's standing next to Aura and that wallpaper for that Lo-Fi Chill mod. This is not actually an endorsement and not part of the actual script, but we must save that cat, guys. Download Opera GX, you can use the GX mod services, and your new browser won't hog your PC resources. Thanks for sponsoring this video, Opera GX. PSO, or Phantasy Star Online, which launched near the turn of the century, would put Japan on the map in terms of online virtual world gaming, preferring the smaller environments, action gameplay, and story and cooperative focus of their games. But PSO wasn't the only online title that Japan would flex. A successful sequel would come later too, as well as a number of other MMORPG-style titles analogous to Japan. However, likely after seeing the major success of PSO, a single-player JRPG series turned online game and then anime, Atlus of Shin Megami Tensei and Persona fame would throw their hat in the ring as well. Atlus would form an online studio under the developer Cave and team up with publisher Gung Ho to launch what was originally known as Megami Tensei Online Imagine in April 2007 in Japan, and a year later in the US dubbed Shin Megami Tensei Imagine Online. Megaten, or SMT Imagine, would become a smash hit in Japan and have an impressively long 9-year run there, which is insanely impressive, as for reference it's longer than Dragon's Dogma Online's run. However, Shin Megami Tensei Imagine Online would struggle to find the same success in the West, and that's where we kind of step in. On many episodes of Death of a Game, the series where we cover the largest contributing factors to the death of a game or company by navigating a timeline and grabbing any clues along the way to compile them for a final deduction, every detective's favorite, we feature Eastern or Western titles that failed to capture the opposite audiences, and we detail why. SMTO is no different here, and we will cover both the largest contributing factors for the game's eventual shutdown and why it didn't share the same level of success that it had in Japan as it did in the rest of the world. And, well, detectives, what are you waiting for? Choose your demon and let's get to exploring this Megaten world. The story begins quite far back actually. You see, the story actually begins with Shin Megami Tensei 9, which launched in 2002. According to Atlus, the developers behind the Megami Tensei series and then the subsequent spin-off Persona series, SMT 9 was supposed to have multiplayer as well and launch for the Xbox too, much like PSO did. SMT 9, however, would have its online elements removed due to rising costs and was purely a single-player offering by its launch in 2002. The development would thus begin sometime in 2002, following the release of SMT 9 and begin from the remaining online portions that were reportedly cut from 9. Atlus would first work on the title for a number of years, developing the online infrastructure with a Japanese company, ISAO, and classifying the game as a traditional Japanese online RPG. This gets around the server-based issues that MMORPGs usually suffer from, such as a single server instance, and it better suits their community, which isn't nearly as focused on massive online content. The planner of the project, Hajime Tanigawa, had experience in the 90s working on other SMT games, but after working on the project for a number of years, they would then transfer the development to another Japanese developer, more known for their shoot-'em-up style games, Cave. Cave consisted of former Atlus staff members including Hajime, and Cave would work on the remaining 20 months of the game's development. What's interesting though is that Cave joining the fray wasn't them just taking over another developer's plan, but something far more serious. Cave would actually change the entire perception and marketing around SMT Imagine. While Megami Tensei Online Imagine, as it was originally being dubbed and sold as, was developed as a classical Japanese online RPG, when Cave took over, they shifted the game to being more of an MMORPG to match what was prevalent in South Korea at the time. The problem being, not only did they not have any experience of such, while the Japanese audience might still see the game in some ways as an online RPG, other audiences might not, and might be let down by how unmassive or MMORPG-like the game was and wasn't in many ways. But perhaps Megaton could be the first title to bring Western or Korean design popularity to Japan. Cave would only then have another 10 months to work on SMT before having to be ready for launch. And according to project director Hajime Tanigawa, it would state wanting to release an MMORPG from Japan as well as making it a free-to-play game, which he would admit wasn't analogous to the market of the time in Japan. The issue being, even in the early interviews, they seem to, as a development team, kind of misunderstand what makes these sort of games work. For example, Tanigawa would express that wanting you to reach max level quickly was a big focus of the game, and him, and to play other characters as well. But as many people now know in the future, Japan would kind of ironically go the complete opposite direction as a market, at least most popularly with Final Fantasy XIV. But this also goes against the leveling and time spent leveling, and needed for a virtual world. Even MMORPGs can encourage making more characters, but those leveling experiences are still worthwhile ones, like Phantasy Star Online. Another issue presented in the same interview is that Tanigawa would state that they wanted to make a dungeon-based game to appeal to the Megami Tensei fans, but were struggling to find the chance to open things up like an MMORPG due to the expectations of that series. I think this is one of those things that you probably shouldn't have tried to overcome, as your fanbase is already telling you what they want, and you're trying to make something else. But what Cave did make sure to do was work alongside Atlus and the proper SMT materials to make the upcoming online game as lore accurate and inspired as possible. This would range anywhere from the story, to the demons utilized and present, and naturally the art style itself, which is kind of like a dark anime style, a personal favorite of mine I should add. Megami Tensei Online Imagine was proving to have many issues, some not so obvious, from the start however, which makes both its story to and after launch and the success that much more impressive. In a sense, this isn't unlike other pioneers in the Japanese virtual space, like Phantasy Star Online, which faced so many issues in development that they had to basically bundle people free internet to even be able to play their game, and release multiple disc versions of the game. And yet, the Japanese virtual world market has been chugging for 20 plus years now, and has always faced a number of issues, many being local ones, and something to do with the global perception as well, which really makes its ascent to the top, these days, both unlikely and quite impressive at the same time. Cave and Atlus, because these companies were pretty linked at the time, and often interchangeably listed on press releases. The guy leading the project, for example, as I mentioned, was the former Atlus developer, which showcased the game for the first time at Tokyo Game Show, October 2004. At this time it was being listed as an MMARPG and not an MMORPG, which was quite common, as WoW really made MMORPG the de facto term for all, even if incorrectly in some ways. GameSpot, in their hands-on, would say that they enjoyed what they had played and found it promising. However, they would also acknowledge things like how the demon system, where you would essentially Pokemon catch a demon in the wild and have it assist you as a pet, were complicated because they essentially forced a companion system on you as a player, while other games, I should add, make it an optional class instead. Other issues being that the demons themselves shared the same art style as each other, which made it hard to distinguish your demon from the other creatures you were fighting. There wasn't an NA launch planned yet, but things were pointing to that being very likely, especially with the success of yet another Japanese virtual world in the West, Phantasy Star Online. MTO, or Megaton, would have a lengthy 10-month closed beta, where much of the game wasn't even complete yet. This was not like most closed betas, and showed both how much the Cave team had to rush around the clock to push the game out, and how much they were also sort of behind schedule. Reportedly, the game would only take around 3 years of development or less, which is an insane thing for a multitude of reasons, and it's mostly insane because MMORPGs take on average 4 to 5 years. It's also just hard to build the hype cycle for a game in such a short time, and obviously it's hard to develop that game in that time, and it's hard to also maintain a game and team during that time as well, because you have to crunch constantly. Really, the Megaton team was having to work against many odds that were just stacked against their favor. MTOI would launch in Japan April 2007, and although the game was changed to be styled more like a Korean MMORPG, the Japanese audience actually responded quite positively to such. They would even be able to score an impressive 130,000 members with the several few thousand concurrent at the same time. This is even good for modern standards. Now remember though, MTO Imagine was free to play, so this would also help there tremendously, but what was really helping them was the fact that the game was featuring the SMT name. SMT was a well-known IP in Japan already, and way more well-known in Japan than the rest of the world. Engadget would also tackle the new title sometime after its launch and had the following to say about the game. Graphically, the game is very unique. A little bland here and there, but still very different. In fact, I would rather have a game that featured flowing graphics that look like they all belonged in the same world rather than have a game with trees or textures that do not fit at all. And let's face it, the real stars of Imagine Online are the demons, tameable monsters, many of them humanoid, that fight at your side. The sheer variety is mind-blowing. And as you grow to understand the lore, the cartoony ones fit perfectly well and are not distracting. They would end their thoughts with, "Will Imagine Online stay on my hard drive? It has for a long time. Will I return to it more often than before? More than likely." Take your time with Imagine Online, it's intense. Enjoy all the great cutscenes that pepper your leveling experience. While the cash shop does sell some of the best items in game, I had no issues surviving until level 19 without spending a dime. The largest negatives of the game, however, were kind of predictable from the start. The repeatable locations and dungeons making the majority of those who play MTOI meme about the hallways and corridors as being a big feature of the game, kind of like a typical Shin Megami Tensei or Persona game in some ways. The difference is that those games weren't trying to be massive, and they didn't have to repeatedly make you play the same levels nearly to the same extent. And even then, in the ways in which MTOI is massive is not really that unique compared to other massive online titles, and it's not that plentiful either. And when compared to similar titles, since they changed genres now, like PSO, MTO might offer a better packaged story, but the story quests in MTO are few and far in between, and require you to grind to even access the later ones, so it lacks a lot of continuity. This is because the game is stretched both by the world size and content size to try and service players for 90 plus different levels in a more MMORPG-like sense. What it led to was a weaker presentation, a lack of MMO content anyway, and a seemingly less cooperatively focused game. However, for some, that was the charm of MTO. It was the first Japanese attempt at an MMORPG, even if it wasn't a very massive one at all. There still was a lot to like about the game. It clearly had a lot of work put into the lore and background setting, unlike many other virtual worlds, even famous ones, though the combat was basically just Mabinogi, but worse. Think rock, paper, scissors and action hotkeys, and a less traditional tap target style of play. That's a bit of the downside, I think, of making the game more MMORPG-like, is that you lose a better combat system that pretty much all other Japanese online RPGs have. But there was more to like about MTOI, such as the challenging gameplay, the demon collecting that the game featured, and how everyone looked quite unique. But something about the game also just felt poorly streamlined when compared to other MMOs of the time, and lacking some of the better parts of the Japanese online RPG design. An example of this is the absolutely boring and copy-paste mini-games that exist when you try to extract plasma in the game, or how disliked the gameplay is in general. Japanese online RPGs are almost always known for their gameplay and having fun minigames, so MTOI really did feel like a fish out of water there, and I see that as a big negative coming from their attempt to make their game massive. Though I must confess, perhaps without them focusing so much on that, they wouldn't have crafted one of the better and more immersive virtual worlds ever, even if it is a little rough around the edges. After Megami Tensei Imagine Online's success in Japan, the title would be rebranded to Shin Megami Tensei Imagine Online and brought to the West by the end of 2008. Ars Technica and their hands-on acknowledged the darker tone of the game and the unique on-use skill system, and just how original the game was. While Siliconera acknowledged, beautifully I might add, how difficult the game was and how it required them to actually learn encounters and practice their character. Boy, do I love Japanese design. Shin Megami Tensei Imagine Online would launch in the West December 2008 in North America and January 2009 in Europe, respectively, after teaming up with American publisher Area Games. Area Games would later merge with Gamago, forming basically the Axis of Evil. These two companies are for-profit porters who take Asian titles and monetize them heavily in the West, and as you can imagine, this has developed their reputation somewhat negatively, understandably. This meant that SMT would face some new issues finding popularity online in the West, due to the negative public perception around the company they chose to get in bed with. This could be a reason why there was always a significant amount of Western players playing on the Japanese servers, which you can easily find confirmation of online with various translation guides that exist. However, now that the rest of the world had access to the game, we could see that there was an issue with perception and not being able to meet industry or genre standards and more. Eurogamer in their hands-on of SMTO would exclaim that although they enjoyed much about the game, they felt that the random dungeons would be a bit of a deal breaker for those that weren't familiar with the series, which the last bit is a bit more of my words, and players might be let down when they figure out that at the core, Shin Megami Tensei Imagine Online is merely a PSO-like or MMORPG masqueraded and sold as an MMORPG. My most charitable read of this, and I kind of agree with it, is that Cave wanted to make their online RPG more broadly appealing and attract more than just a Japanese audience. The problem is, instead of leaning into the Western aspects, and yet remaining true to your own market at the same time, like Final Fantasy XIV would later do, they tried to make a more Korean-like MMORPG that would appeal to two different audiences, Japan and the West, in ways that it just normally didn't. I mean, it was incredibly ambitious, but my point is more for what reason, and what cost ultimately. Now with SMT in the West, many players quite easily felt it wasn't that massive, and it didn't match what they expected from an MMORPG, and it was hurting the game's perception and the audience retention, because players don't like to be let down or play something that's not what they expected or were told. Worse, the most glaring aspect now on full display in this whole Koreanization process was the monetization. Yes, even Cave themselves acknowledged that free-to-play and microtransactions filled in their store wasn't really native to Japan, and would require swimming against the tide of things. Even worse, they didn't just go for a tame version of said Korean cash shop or a modern-day Western one. They went full bore and were allowing you to straight up purchase some of the most powerful items in the game, and some of them costing as much as $15. Yes, sadly, SMT Online's biggest issue in the West wasn't just the poor perception or poor translation. It was the monetization that was so pay to win, it was impossible to have your favorite anime avatar friend lie to you about it. And this was at the time that pay-to-win was still forming its early legs, which made the perception around Shin Megami Tensei Imagine Online even more negative, including with the help of Area Games, which kept away players like myself and many more. Like the Japanese ORPGs that came before it, SMT Online would introduce new content, and since they didn't have to reissue new discs like PSO, it was much easier to do. Blaze of Ambition would launch in May of 2009 and introduce PvP in the form of a 5v5 Coliseum and a new fate dubbed Destiny that allowed for 15 versus 15 PvPvE. I actually enjoyed this expansion, at least from afar, as I'm a big fan of PvPvE. I also felt like the modes in an expansion like this was something that PSO just didn't do, so it felt more of like an innovation to me personally. But something that must be acknowledged is the divide between the East and West on matters of PvP. Now, both regions obviously enjoy it, but in different ways. Western players sometimes mistake Eastern titles like Lineage or Ion or Arcade as being PvE or grind-focused games. And that's kind of true, they are grind-focused, but the three of these games are actually incredibly PvP-focused games almost to a fault. Eastern players enjoy grinding their characters to absurd levels and then PvPing with said character, while Western players can trend more towards a fair PvP system with things like arena and PvP gear. Obviously, both regions enjoy massive PvP, who doesn't, but in a Korean sense, to reach that massive PvP, it's almost expected that you're going to have to grind to absurd degrees like in Black Desert Online. And I think that that's a bit of the confusion with SMT. It wasn't that grindy of a game, yet didn't have the gameplay to boast like PSO or Monster Hunter. The identity of the game just kind of seemed confused, and it likely made updates like Blaze of Ambition just not hit nearly as hard as it could have, especially when it truly is difficult to make a virtual world for multiple regions. I think we really underestimate the success and genius of Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn in that sense. But maybe titles like SMT walked, so Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn could later run. And, I mean, to be fair, PSO2 would later feature some mechanics that SMT technically did too, though they weren't the first. While it's difficult to find more information on the official updates of SMT Online, especially when it seems not all of them were even brought to the West right away, I did find in my research that there was another update post-expansion. It was dubbed the Aikubukuro update, which would add the region of the same name, which was the largest yet in the game. It would also add a casino, kind of making my Final Fantasy memes a little bit realer, right? It was a good update though, all around. Area Games would exit the conversation and situation sometime in 2012, after handing back the reins to Atlas Online, a company erected to run the game. Area Games likely had got tired of paying the royalties, or perhaps just didn't think it was worth the squeeze anymore, especially because they already tried to wring that lemon for nearly everything it already had in such a short time. Atlas taking control back was seen as a homecoming though, and not really a negative thing going forward. And honestly, they were better off without Area Games involved. After a number of years, however, Atlus would sell Atlus Online, and Marvelous USA, also known as Exceed, would take control of Megaton. This would only last for 6 months with the new management, as Shin Megami Tensei Imagine in the West would be shut down. And this would force the remaining player base, which wasn't particularly large, to play on the Japanese servers, which many players from the West had already been doing from the start, much like in PSO2, because it took ages to come to the West. However, after just 2 more years, the Japanese servers would be shut down too, making Megaton unplayable for all and shuttering another virtual world in the process. What must be mentioned though is that Imagine ran for 9+ years in Japan, which was insanely impressive and comparable to PSO2 later on. Not just because too, that 9 years from any region is impressive, but also because Japan has a notorious history of killing their own successful MMORPGs almost prematurely. The community, though, wouldn't give up on their cult classic virtual world, however, and sometime in 2021 would erect the private server fully playable. Now, the issue with virtual world preservation is that unlike single-player games, it's not really currently possible with the current laws and situations. At best, a virtual world can be parked offline in a museum, which doesn't do much to preserve the world. In an ideal world, the mechanisms would allow for the servers and games to remain on community servers, or what is called private servers, but not all developers and publishers are so friendly to this idea. Which is why the legality and fine print needs to back things up as well, so you're not just reliant on the goodwill of those who shut the game down in the first place. Because of this fact, I'm always supportive of community efforts to preserve servers even when they sometimes lack finesse, professionalism, or moderation of the official servers, which can lead to innumerable issues. Atlus, though, would sue the makers of the private server, threatening full legal action in the process, and showcasing their unwillingness and disrespect for virtual world preservation. Though reportedly, the case would be ultimately dropped. But look, if you guys don't want to run your game anymore, which was sold on that promise, just let someone else do it. No one's even saying they have to make money or don't have to pay you a royalty for it. And while a few private servers would be shuttered in the process, some just out of the mere fear of legal action, Imagine still today has a functioning private server. So if you never got the chance to play the closest thing to a Pokemon or Persona MMO, play Shin Megami Tensei Imagine Online or SMTO or Megaton. Here's your chance. And of course, if you're curious why the game was able to be so successful in Japan despite so much working against it, or you just missed it the first time around, shout out to the Megaton community for keeping this impressively deep world alive. Now, before we get to the final deduction, I want to acknowledge the current state of the SMT series, and talk about the Persona series as well, partly to round out the story, but also to talk about more possibilities of more multiplayer content. First, let's just acknowledge it. Outside of the moderately successful and popular SMT5, which launched in 2021, the Persona series, the spin-off series, has reached far greater success of late. You have Persona 4 Golden, Persona 5, both mega hits, and various remasters and side games that launched even more recently to some adoration. While different teams work on these different projects, one series is clearly getting more of a focus, which begs the question, if SMT won't be the one to bring back online play, could Persona do it? Well, it already has some multiplayer features. It has aspects in both Personas that I mentioned where you can actually read the messages from your friends who played online at different points of the game. Other players can also even help you in SOSs and dungeons and heal you. While these are very limited multiplayer options, at least it shows that Persona and the SMT series still has some aspects of multiplayer left. But I will be quite honest. Although I actually believe in a future online title utilizing either of these IPs, I don't know how much Atlus will be motivated to do that. The company hasn't made a unique title in quite a while and seems to largely rely on their old catalog, especially after being acquired by the Sega Index Corporation. I'm not saying they're on the chopping block. I mean, Persona 3 Reload just sold like crazy hotcakes, but I mean to address my point about could or would Persona or the SMT series go online again, and at this point I just don't see it being that likely. Sure, MMORPGs are only more popular and insanely trendy right now, but they're also super competitive. Final Fantasy XIV, Monster Hunter World, and soon Wilds and PSO are still stiff competition for any new MMORPG trying to launch. And launching an MMORPG, as Imagine showed in the first place from Japan, is nearly impossible because you're going up against a completely different genre in your local market. Unless Atlus teams up with another online developer, and one of the ones I probably just referenced, it's not going to happen, in my opinion. But I will happily and readily eat crow. The music is playing in the background, which means that we had reached the end of this case, detectives. For those who are paying attention along the way, you probably have already gathered enough clues to crack this case. But for those who didn't, don't worry, it's time for the final deduction. And I'm ready to put this case to bed. Why did SMTO, or its various acronyms, fail to catch flight in the West? Blatant pay-to-win. Poorly marketed and sold. It didn't iterate enough on Japanese MMORPG design, nor really the Western MMORPG design. It chose a poor Western representation in area games. Design was caught in a dilemma. It had a fairly rudimentary combat system and a forced pet system. Lack of streamlining or quality of life. In the end, Shin Megami Tensei gave birth to many more demons, or at least their most popular forms, and the players behind those demons. It brought life to an online genre in a new way that hadn't even been seen in Japan yet, and SMTO was still from an age where it could be argued that SMT was still the most popular franchise. Much has changed now, including that, but Imagine still manages to exist in the community servers, so in the end, nothing changes when a good community gets a hold of a virtual world, at least not completely. Now, I don't know how many will remember the story for this reason, but SMT Imagine for me is such an interesting story because it's the first time that Japan tried to make an MMORPG, and especially at least a Korean one, and they largely succeeded at that. Thanks for watching.